Welcome to Bat Lessons, the Batman History Podcast. I'm Alex.
And I'm Brian.
And this month, we're cozying up by the fireplace, pouring some hot cocoa, settling in for the holidays, and reading Batman Noel. You excited?
Yeah, I am. I really like this book. I'm really stoked to talk about it.
Yeah, kind of a modern classic. Thought it would be a good opportunity to do something a little bit different, but in the same vein as Gotham by Gaslight, which we did last month, that ties into sort of the Victorian history theme while still being a modern comic book. Keep that sort of going. Although if you've had enough, don't worry. I think this is the last in the Victorian saga. We did Spring Hill Jack, Gotham by Gaslight, and now Batman Noel. Yeah. So before we jump into the story, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about A Christmas Carol. If you're not familiar with Batman Noel, it's not really an adaptation of A Christmas Carol. It's more of like, you know, a riff on A Christmas Carol. They play with that story. And so I thought it would be good to talk just a little bit about that story and its author, Charles Dickens. What do you know about Dickens?
Well, so I think it would be worth setting the audience up a little bit to say Batman Noel is the Christmas Carol, it's the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, but Batman version of it. Like, I think by the title, that's not obvious. When you read through it, it's quite obvious, but like making sure everyone's on the same page. Like, it is, like you said, a riff, but it has all the same main beats of the story. So what do I know about Charles Dickens? Very little. I know he wrote the Christmas Carol. That's kind of the long and the short of it. I've not dug into that dude.
Okay. Hey folks, Alex from the future. In the original recording, Brian and I spent the next 16 minutes talking about Charles Dickens as context for A Christmas Carol and Batman Noel. A few days later, I had some synapses fire and realized I'm actually friends with a Charles Dickens expert, Dr. Jennifer Conary. So I reached out and was able to arrange an interview for the show. The interview does a way better job than I could, so instead of that original conversation Brian and I had, I've put an excerpt from that interview here. If you like what you hear, keep your eyes open on the podcast feed and YouTube channel, and we'll post that interview in its entirety as its own episode soon. Dr. Conary earned her PhD from the University of Southern California and now serves as an associate professor and honors program director at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. Her work focuses on Victorian literature and culture, women writers and writing about women, the periodical press, and popular fiction. She has published works about Benjamin Disraeli, Charles Dickens, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and more. Her current research is on courtesans and mistresses in Victorian culture. Her work has also recently included George William MacArthur Reynolds, a best-selling author of popular fiction in the Victorian era. Dr. Conary serves as the vice president of the International GWM Reynolds Society, of which she was a founding member. Just this year, Routledge Group published a book Dr. Conary co-edited and contributed to called Reynolds Reimagined, which in its own words seeks to excavate Reynolds from obscurity and position him as more than yet another curiosity in the vast monopoly of Victorian print. Dr. Conary is also an accomplished educator, regularly teaching courses at DePaul on topics including Gothic literature, Victorian women writers, Jane Austen, and Charles Dickens. For that great work, she has been recognized by DePaul with the 2018 College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Excellence in Teaching Award and the 2018 Gerald D. Pesch Academic Advising Award. So yeah, we're honored today to have Dr. Conary join us. Welcome to Bat Lessons.
Thanks for having me.
We're super thrilled that you're going to be here to help us understand Dickens and some of the other 19th century fiction that we've been looking back over for the last few episodes. But I should preface that Brian and I were both software engineers. So we've tried our best to prepare for an interesting interview, but our knowledge in history and literature is novice level. So I think we have an audience that's interested in this sort of thing, but definitely treat us like you would an undergrad in like an intro level course, because we're coming in kind of cold.
Totally fine.
So I'm always curious to learn about another person's passions. So what brought you to Victorian literature?
That is a great question. It was a circuitous path. So I guess I've always loved the 19th century, that I was like the weird kid in middle school who was reading Victor Hugo and Tolstoy.
Nice.
And so that's what I did
Very
in
cool.
high school. I've always loved long novels. But I really fell in love with the 19th century in college through history, really more than literature. I just find it a really fascinating period that, you know, it's where our modern world, I think, really started to come into being. And so it's fascinating to me to be able to watch that, over the course of 100 years and then see how it interacts with pop culture.
Totally.
And I'm also addicted to novels. And so I think the 19th century has the best novels. So it was natural that I became a Victorianist eventually.
So Victorianist is the term.
Yes.
I had no
There we
idea.
go.
Our fancy
know.
term, yes, for those of us who are weirdos who do things like go to the Dickens universe.
So for those in the audience who may only know Charles Dickens as the person who wrote the story that A Muppet Christmas Carol is based on, or that, Oliver Twist is the person that said, "Please, sir, I want some more." Could you tell us a bit more about Dickens and who he was?
Well, that's a great start. He was, what I love most about Dickens is I really do think he's one of the best writers from the 19th century and really of all time. I think he's a fantastic storyteller. And that's the reason I think his novels, more than most others, have really lived on. Those stories are still with us, like A Christmas Carol, which has been reinvented in so many different ways and continues to be reinvented. But he's a complicated man, which I'm sure we'll get into. But he was always, his novels are so much about, I don't know, looking out for the underdog, for, trying to appeal to people's sympathy, to get them to care about their fellow creatures and about these important social issues. And that's what I love about Dickens, that he does. I tend to like dark Dickens, which is post 1850. So you cited Oliver Twist and Christmas Carol. Those are all like early, I say, schmaltzy Dickens, when he's most sentimental. He becomes much more cynical later in life, which is when I like him. But, all of his books, the short stories, the novels, even his magazines that he edited, I think are always interested in the human condition and really trying to get people to think about each other and to have sympathy.
You mentioned like he changed throughout his career, like knowing that I was reading about it earlier that he wrote A Christmas Carol when he was like 30. It's like younger than I am now. I feel like such a failure in life, knowing that he achieved such success.
I hear you. Well, he was already a best-selling novelist in his like mid-20s.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
So we've spoken on the show a little bit about like literacy rates through history and how like pulp fiction and popular fiction sort of increases over time. In the case of Dickens, he's right smack in the middle of the 19th century, where like we entered with like 50% literacy and ended with like 90, depending on who you ask. So he's like right in the middle of that. Who is Dickens writing for? And more broadly, who's consuming his novels at that time?
It's actually kind of a complicated question. That he writes for a middle-class audience, that he's definitely a middle-class author who has middle-class values, and his prose is sophisticated enough that it would be, not as accessible to people with a pretty low literacy level, like the working classes. And so his primary readers are the middle class, I think. Middle class is upper class. But a lot of people consumed Dickens in ways other than reading his novels. And so he has this much broader audience that comes from stage adaptations of people who would go to the theater and see all unauthorized versions of Dickens's novels on stage. They would read these knockoffs, that there's tons of working class versions of Dickens's novels, things like Oliver Twist and the Penny Pickwick. And so a lot of people come to Dickens and are huge fans without ever having read actual Dickens. And that's how he gets this really broad appeal. But we best know, we still, through school primarily, through college, through middle school, through high school, when Dickens is still taught, we still primarily read middle-class fiction from the 19th century. And so that's how I think he's largely lived on. But it was his kind of unauthorized versions that really broadened his appeal in the 19th century.
When people think about a novel today, they usually think about like a single book, like a volume that you pick up and you read together, like not in one sitting per se, but like, but at the time, is it correct to say that most of his novels were serializations?
Yes, all of his novels were serialized. And we have little things like A Christmas Carol, which isn't a novel. It's, I don't know what, we would call it a novella probably,
Right.
but they don't really have a term for it in the 19th century.
Mhm.
But all of his novels were serialized. And this is what makes Dickens an extraordinary writer, in my view. I always talk about him whenever I teach the 19th century or teach the Victorian period because of what he does to the form of the novel. Accidentally, incidentally enough, that Pickwick Papers, which is what he was hired for originally, he was just like this kid, right? He's in his early 20s. And as they do today, right, they're going to hire some kid to just do something no one cares about, which was to write copy for these illustrations that were done by an actual famous illustrator.
Right.
And so he was hired to do that. And the famous story goes that that illustrator actually committed suicide after I think it was the second number. And so Dickens was this kid that no one had heard of, was left with this subscription. People had subscribed to these installments, mainly for the illustrations. And so they're like, well, you know, crap, we have this thing that people are expecting. What do we do with it? And Dickens had already tried to shift it in a different direction. And then he just ran with that. And turns out he was extremely talented, right? And so people fell in love with Pickwick Papers. It's his first novel, but it didn't start out as a novel. And you can, it's a fascinating text. It's a tough text. Most people do not read Pickwick Papers today. But you can actually see it become a novel as it progresses through the installments, that it suddenly has a real plot. It has characters that develop. And so but because it was in those installments, this wasn't new, that we had done kind of serialized narratives back in the 18th century, but this was such a smashing success, made this a really lucrative publishing endeavor. So these little penny, they're not published as volumes, so these little paper, I wish I would have brought mine, I would have shown you guys, my little paper segments of installations, and they were cheap, extremely cheap to publish. And so cheap installments for a broad audience meant lots of money for the publishers. So part of this is economic. But what's extraordinary about Dickens is that he was the master of this form, and it was an extremely stressful form to write in. So all but 3 of his novels were monthlies. So there would be a monthly installment that you would subscribe to. And most of them go across about 14 months. And that's why all of his novels are exactly the same length, that they are meant to, that each installment was a specific number of pages. So you probably heard the rumor in high school, like, Dickens, the novels are so long because he got paid by the word. That's the equivalent of saying that TV writers today are paid by the minute. Well, sort of, right? Yeah. But the TV episodes have to be, like 43 minutes or, 57 minutes on HBO or these various different lengths. And so that's what Dickens was doing, was writing to the installment or the parameters. But what makes him remarkable, and if you read any of his long novels, I hope that, listeners out there will appreciate this, that he did most of them with pretty much like a bare bones outline. And when you're serializing, you can't go back and edit. So the characters that you start out with, like, that's what you're stuck with for the next 14 months. And so he was able to do this, and this is all handwritten too. Remember, there's no delete, there's no copy and paste, that there are no typewriters. That he was able to write to the specific length each month. He almost never underwrote or overwrote a number piece, and to keep control of these massive stories with, some of them have, I think, close to 100 characters, and not screw up.
Wow,
That's
really
remarkable.
impressive.
Yeah, it really is.
And 100 characters to keep them all in your head, right? Keep them all straight. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. And if you read, he has 3 weeklies, and weeklies were even more stressful because then you have to really do these short segments. But you may have been forced to suffer through Great Expectations in high school, which just breaks my heart. I wish no one would teach it in high school because it's such a great novel, and 16-year-olds just can't appreciate it.
Sure.
But that was a weekly, and that one he did really with no outline. That it's a perfectly structured novel, and it's remarkable that it was written the way that it was. But that was one of his late novels, so he was really good at that point. But yeah, that's how novels were consumed. And I always tell my students, like, don't feel bad if you are, feeling really stressed trying to read 100 pages at a time. Like, that was never what these novels were meant for. They were television shows. They were the 19th century, version of TV. So you'd have to wait for traditional TV before Netflix binging.
Sure.
Where you would have to wait for each segment to come out.
I think our audience probably can relate. Comic books are monthly to this day. So even like graphic novels came out, once a month and in given size and things like that. And I can't imagine doing weekly. There are occasionally comic books that release weekly these days, but often they have multiple writers because that is quite a lot to keep up with.
It totally is. And it was extremely stressful. And Dickens was a workaholic, and he would often have multiple projects going on at once. In fact, A Christmas Carol was written in 6 weeks. And he did it while he was writing one of his serial novels, Martin Chuzzlewit. And there's a good reason that you have never heard of that novel, because it was a flop. It was really a hard time in Dickens's life. But he was so good at staying on top of everything. He didn't sleep, like, literally. And he was an incredible guy in that respect.
Wow. Oh, well, and then yeah. Well, I'm also thinking about, like, the number of characters you have to keep straight, and if you're doing multiple books at the same time, or works, you have to keep them all straight that way too. I can barely keep, like, my coworkers straight. That's crazy, right?
Right? I know. And he just, he almost never messes up. And if you read other serial novelists from the 19th century, and almost all 19th century novels are either published in volume form, 3 volumes, or serialized. So many other novelists make mistakes that they suddenly forget a character's name and start calling them something else halfway through. Or there's, like, plot lines that go nowhere, and you're like, wait a minute, what happened to so-and-so? But never Dickens.
It's like recasting without ever acknowledging the change. That's
Totally.
good. Okay, so help us understand how big Dickens was at the time. I read a presumably apocryphal story that when he passed away, a young girl said something like, "What's next? Will Father Christmas die?" So, I mean, he must be big, since the term like Dickensian came directly from his name and influence. So who would you compare him to today in his fame, his influence, stuff like that? Now, how big was he?
He was really big. Like, he was a major celebrity that everyone had heard of. I was really trying to think about this, what parallels. And the issue is that our culture right now has become so fractured. I think that even, for those of us who are old enough, like growing up in the 80s or the 90s, where everyone was watching the same TV shows, like that, there was a much more centralized culture. But, it's like probably like, if someone hadn't heard of Beyonce, like, who hasn't heard of Beyonce anywhere in the world? Like, everyone knows her. Or Taylor Swift, right? That level of celebrity. But as far as, like, being universally beloved, I was trying to think. I was like, Dolly Parton, right? We would all be so sad if Dolly Parton died. That she has, like, not just, like, people don't love her so much because of her music, but because of, like, what she stands for.
Her
and
character,
who she is.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And Dickens had this highly cultivated and very controlled image that he had propagated. He was a very successful sort of propagandist for his own kind of persona and lifestyle that he kept in the public eye. And that kept him pretty universally beloved by, especially English and American culture, but also European culture. He was big abroad as well. And so, like, his death was this huge thing that struck everybody, which is what that story is from. And so that is accurate. Like, losing him was like losing this national treasure. And but it was definitely a reputation that he helped build. Like, if Dickens were alive today, he would totally be on social media, and I think he'd be a master of, like, constructing this persona, like Taylor Swift. Maybe Dickens and Taylor Swift have a lot in common.
There you go.
That's really good. So we've spoken on the show about the conditions that faced people living in Victorian England. For example, we talked about the state of medical and material sciences, as well as the intense urbanization caused by industrialization. We've also talked a bit about massive income inequality and the poor laws and workhouses. In our other recording session, Alex gave like a 60-second speed run on Chartism. But we've spent almost no time talking about class, gender, and other social issues in that era. I assume also teaching on these topics, you encounter many students with cursory understandings of these topics. Could you speak a little bit about the social and political climate at the time?
That is a big ask, and I am so impressed that you talked about Chartism. Like, bravo! That's a pretty arcane political movement for most people. Um, but so you have talked about class. If you've talked about Chartism, the New Poor Law,
Mm-hmm.
like all of those things are about class inequality, and the 19th century British novels, like this is the dominant topic. I always tell my students that class is to the British novel what race is to the American novel. That's kind of the fundamental divide in British society was class based. And so Dickens is a great novelist for that, that he really does kind of suss out all of the complexities of what was going on in the mid 19th century, which becomes the middle class century, that what we really see just prior really to, well, in my terms, I think of a decade as recent or as a short period of time, but in the decade between the first Reform Act and 1843, when A Christmas Carol comes out, then we have that's the 1832 Reform Act was really about enfranchising the middle classes. So even middle class people didn't have a vote prior to that. And so that gives the middle class votes. It gets them into parliament. It starts to shift the power balance into Britain becoming a middle class nation. And at the same time, of course, we have, all of these wealthy industrialists that you guys talked about getting huge fortunes, and then that increasing wealth gap, as we say today, between the people who are now newly extremely wealthy and the people who are really, really poor. And Dickens he's of course very critical of the extremely wealthy, usually, and especially the industrialists and anyone who's treating people badly, and his rich people are often bad. And then he's always sympathetic to the poor. The sort of caveat there, though, is something like A Christmas Carol. In the early novels, all of the early novels, so Pickwick, Nickleby, and then like Christmas Carol, have these, like, I call them fairy godfather figures, that they have these like great benefactors who are these rich dudes who mean well, and they come in and they give everyone tons of money and they make things better for those people, this small little circle. Scrooge buying his turkeys and, showering people with gifts on Christmas morning.
Right.
That really is kind of a way of representing a resolution to social problems. By the time we hit Bleak House in 1852, Dickens has left that behind. Instead, he complicates that image in Bleak House with philanthropy and kind of satirizing philanthropy itself. Great Expectations, if you've read that, of what, a fairy godfather figure, the destruction that causes to Pip's kind of moral compass. It becomes complicated. But class, the class divide is really something that is throughout. I mean, it's still with us, obviously, today, but it's one of the dominant kind of conversations. And some of that is because of enfranchisement, that we see this, 3/4 of a century. So it really starts in like the 1830s or late 1820s, clear up through the turn of the century, this push for expansion of the franchise, if more and more people getting the vote, until we have universal male suffrage. And then, the women have to wait a few more decades into the 20th century. But that brings gender up, that Christmas Carol is a little bit early for the rise of the women's rights movement. Early feminists really emerge at the end of the 1840s. So Christmas Carol is 43, and like Seneca Falls Convention, if you've heard of that, it's from 1848. And we start to see kind of organized women's groups emerge in the early 1850s. And then it's really not, we start to see kind of women's suffrage kind of a thing in the 1860s, but it's the kind of typical idea we have of like suffragettes doesn't really come until like the late 1880s, 1890s. So it takes a while.
That's all we have time for in this episode. Otherwise, it's going to be way, way too long. So subscribe and keep an eye on the podcast feed for the full interview coming soon. You do not want to miss it. Dr. Conary tells us all about Victorian genre fiction that grows many of the tropes that we expect from Batman. And also, she shares some of her thoughts on the character of Batman himself.
A Christmas Carol. What do you know about A Christmas Carol?
I'll be honest, I know kind of a lot about A Christmas Carol.
Oh, okay.
Not like scholarly levels or anything like
Sure.
that, but I know the story forwards and backwards.
I think most Christians probably do. Americans, people who are familiar with Western culture. It's been adapted so many times.
Yeah, no, I know the adaptation. So the two that I would call out as interesting are A Muppet Christmas Carol.
Yes.
That is a go-to.
Preach.
Like, it's not Christmas if I don't watch that movie.
I'm so
Same
glad.
with Home
Me
Alone.
too.
That's my other one. I gotta watch it. And then the second thing, which I know that A Muppet Christmas Carol takes a few liberties here and there, like Marley and Marley.
Remarkably,
and stuff, but it's pretty on point.
And it reuses a lot of prose. One of the things I love so much about A Christmas Carol is that it tends to be accurate, but even the lines that people use are straight out of the book. And that's one of the things I love so much, is that Dickens' prose is so good and they don't let it go to waste. They're adapting, but they're using as much of the original content as they can. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, if you're a fan of that movie, I recommend going and reading some of the background with Michael Caine and why he took on that role on and what he did in his acting process, because it's pretty interesting how like people act with Muppets and stuff, and like the mental state he took. The second one is actually the Jim Carrey Christmas Carol, which like I think probably a lot of people
think I've seen that.
Don't make the connection, but it is supposed to be very accurate to the book. It is all CG, kind of like Polar Express.
Oh yeah, it was a 3D. This wasn't that long ago.
No, we were in college.
Yeah.
I know that because I worked at the movie theater, and it was one of those like holiday times where like a lot of people were gone, and so I covered other shifts. So over one weekend, between like previewing the movie and then like showing it to audiences, I watched it like 7 times in like 3 days.
Sure.
So like I knew that one pretty well. And then it's kind of like you work in a movie theater, you get sick of popcorn. I didn't eat popcorn for like 10 years or something. I eat it now, but it took a long time for me to be okay with popcorn again after working there. And the same thing with this Christmas Carol movie. I didn't watch it for a long time. I just watched it last year, and I remembered everything. And it's actually way better than I remember it being. But I will say I know the story for Christmas Carol pretty well. Because
do you want to tell us the story if you had to summarize?
Sure. The summary is pretty straightforward. You got a really rich dude who is a total jerk at the beginning.
Ebenezer Scrooge.
He's very much, yes, correct. Yeah, Ebenezer Scrooge. And you've got kind of the counterpoint of him is Bob Cratchit, who is just like a regular Joe, nice guy.
Works for Scrooge,
right? So Scrooge is rich dude and is rich because he loves money. And he loves nothing more than money. So like everything he does is all about getting more money. He's a business
very
person.
Greedy.
Very, very greedy. But like to the extent that like he doesn't heat his house very much because he's like, he's saving. And then Bob Cratchit on the other hand, So Ebenezer Scrooge like has no family essentially. He lives alone in the dark. And then we've got Bob Cratchit, who's like a warm-hearted, nice person who has like kids. He has a wife, and he goes home to a full house, and they're all happy to see him. Like there is a really stark difference between these two characters.
And it's worth noting Bob Cratchit struggling with poverty while working for Scrooge.
Yeah. Like they're asking, like, can we add an extra piece of coal to the fire because it's like
it's cold
chilly
as heck at the office.
It's Christmas. It's like, do you have no holiday spirit? And Scrooge is like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Give me a break, you know. And they kind of like belabor that point by having different people come to the office and like really illustrate how the black-hearted and icy-hearted Scrooge is. So then
his nephew comes at one point. There's someone who comes and is asking for donations for the poor, and he says
he does make an important line that comes up in the story we're gonna tell, which is that they're asking him for money to donate, and he's like, no. And
can't they go to the poorhouses?
If it goes to the poorhouses, essentially, if these people don't get something to eat, they're going to starve and they're going to die. And he says, well, then it will decrease the surplus population. Like, there is a positive in this, which is like pretty ruthless.
I know this by heart. So they ask for a donation. He says no, he says, is there no room at the poorhouses? Is there no, and they say, well, some people would rather die than go to the poorhouses. And he said, well, if they're going to die, they better do it and decrease the surplus population.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. You got it. Nailed it. And so then he goes home and it's all dark. And one of his previous co-owners, right?
Marley.
Yeah. But he was a co-owner.
Jacob Marley.
He was a partner. Partner. That's the word I'm looking for. He was a partner at their business, their firm, and he had died, I think 5 years or 10 years prior.
I don't know. Yeah.
And the ghost of him comes on Christmas Eve and says, and he's covered in chains, and he's like, Scrooge, each link in this chain is a wrong that I did in life. And you've lived longer than me, and you've been meaner than me, and your chains are longer and heavier than mine are. And if you don't change your ways, like, some bad stuff's going to happen to you in the afterlife. And Scrooge is like, oh, no, that's not real. You're crazy. You're
a hallucination.
Exist.
He says, you're not here. Yeah.
And Marley's like, listen, you don't have to believe me, but tonight at midnight, midnight?
I don't know.
You're going to be visited in the night by 3 ghosts, and they're going to change your mind, basically.
Yeah.
And then Marley goes away. Scrooge is like, wow, that was crazy. But it wasn't real. I'm going to go to bed just like I always do. He goes to bed. He wakes up to it's when the bell tolls 1. You asked, and
that's
what
I
thought. That's why I was thinking.
It's 1 a.m.
So 1 a.m. So it's ghost number 1 at 1 a.m. The clock starts dinging, starts chiming, and it's the ghost of Christmas past comes. And this ghost just takes him back to when he was young, and kind of reminding him of, like, life used to be this way. You used to be a happy person. Takes him back to his school, to his first love, stuff like that. And
his first job, things like that.
And is kind of asking him, like, what happened. And
you used to be a happy person. You used to be
Scrooge
kind.
Is being very nostalgic. He's like, oh man, I really liked that girl, man. Whatever happened, And oh, Mr. I know it's Fozzieworth and Muppet.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
But he says, oh, this guy, he gave me my first job. He really taught me how to, like, work in this business. But he was also such a nice guy, and had
recognizing kindness in others.
Blah. Yeah, and it was just very nostalgic for how things were back when he was, like, happy. And yes, identifying these skills and traits in these other people that are lacking in his own. And then I think he goes back to bed. I think they take him back. Yeah. And then the second bell tolls for 2 a.m. and then it's the ghost of Christmas Present. It's a really jolly dude, and he's showing him things that are happening now. So he goes and he takes him to his nephew's party, the nephew that had come to his office and invited him. So then he goes and he gets to hear what people at this party are saying about Ebenezer Scrooge today, which is not very generous.
Yeah, he's observing that they're having fun and they're being kind to each other and they're enjoying the holiday, right? And at the same time, they're trashing Scrooge behind his back, right? Because I invited him to the party, he didn't want to come, and they compare him to a nuisance. They say, oh, I forget if it was a cockroach or a rat, or they compare him to something that's unwanted, right? And who wanted him at the party anyway? He's observing that.
Yeah, And then he goes and he visits Bob Cratchit's house where he comes home to a family that loves him. He gets introduced to Tiny Tim, his
Bob Cratchit's son.
Bob Cratchit's son, who has a disability.
Yeah.
And he asks what's gonna happen. He asks the ghost what's gonna happen to Tiny Tim, and the ghost says, well, if things don't improve in his life, he won't be here much longer. Like I foresee that seat empty at the table next year or something like that.
Yeah.
And then he goes, I don't think he even goes back to bed. I think he just like immediately meets.
I think that happens in the Muppet movie. I don't know if that's what happens in the book.
I know that one much better. But anyway, the bell tolls 3. He meets the third ghost, which is the ghost of Christmas Future. And
Christmas
I think most people are familiar with this visage, but it is death. I mean, it is everything but the scythe. I mean, the robe that goes up over the face.
The Grim Reaper, yeah.
Grim Reaper, yeah. And he goes and he takes him to what the future could look like. And he's seeing like people are, they're talking in kind of coded terms that some old rich person is dead. And they're all trying to get that person's stuff, which includes like his housekeeper like steals his good sheets, right? And people in town are like kind of talking about like, oh, did you hear about what's his face? Yeah, he's dead. Well, there was no one left to miss him, you know. And then they go and I think kind of recognize that no one showed up to the wake or the funeral or something like that.
Right.
And then he goes to the graveyard and realizes
they visit
that
his tombstone.
It's his tomb that is fresh and that he died. And he's like, oh no, what am I going to do about this? How do I live a better life? I've learned I want to change my ways.
Yeah. He basically asks the ghost of Christmas Future, you know, is this the future that is, or just that could be, right?
Yeah.
Can I change this? Is this set in stone? And then sort of throws himself at the spirit and says like, I will change. I will, you know, honor Christmas, you know, in the past, present, and the future. Right. And says, I am a changed man, and tries to convince him verbally. And that spirit doesn't speak to him. Right. It doesn't sort of give him any comfort.
Never says a word the whole time. Just kind of drags him around to see different things.
Yeah.
And so then he wakes up in bed. He runs to the window that's light out. He yells down to someone. It's a child. What day is it? And they say it's Christmas Day, and he says, "Oh, good, I haven't missed it." And
I think that might be unique to the Muppets as well, but
doesn't matter. I think everyone has picked up by now. I'm just like quoting the Muppet,
okay.
The Novelization. But anyway, and so then he goes and he tries to make things better. So like all the people he's run into in the story prior to going to bed, he goes and he does some kindness to them. So he goes and he gives a bunch of money to the, I don't know what those they're called, the people who are asking for money for the poor.
Oh, yeah.
He goes and he gives them a bunch of money.
Come and asked.
He gets the largest chicken and takes it
turkey.
To Bob.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Turkey. Takes it to Bob Cratchit's house to give him like a bonus, and he ups his salary, and he says, I want to make sure that like your family is taken care of and that you're happy and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. I think in the Muppet when he pays the mortgage on their house, I don't know if that happens in the real one or not. But
yeah, I don't remember either.
He also visits the nephew.
He visits the nephew. He like kisses him on the cheek and says something about merriment and Merry Christmas and stuff. And the nephew is like, who are you?
Yeah.
Which is funny. And then like everyone lived happily ever after.
Yeah. That's the story. It's such a good story. I think it's a radically simple story in concept, right? It's the idea that someone's unkind, is greedy, is a miser, is, you know, consumed by, you know, his obsession with, you know, wealth, and doesn't think of others, has some reckoning, right? Has these visions of his past, his present, his future, and that, you know, sees the consequences of his actions, and then says, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be a better person. And then does so. So it's satisfying in that way.
It's kind of like the Grinch as well. Like his heart goes through sizes, and
sure,
like,
yeah.
he was a jerk at the beginning, and at the end everyone loves him because he's so nice and stuff. It's kind of the same concept.
Yeah. And this is at a time where, Christmas is a popular holiday, but probably doesn't have the weight that it does today, in terms of being like sort of the most popular holiday, at least in America. And I assume most of the Western Christian world. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And Dickens, I think, is a big part of popularizing the holiday, right? Reinvigorating our conception of it, our, love affair with it, and the idea of, charity and generosity and its association with that time of year. He also popularizes he didn't coin the phrase humbug or Merry Christmas, but popularizes those things and brings it into popular vernacular, and that sort of persists into today. But I think personally, one of the sort of triumphs, and I said this earlier, of Dickens is his prose. He's a master of simile. He loves to describe and compare and use, language in a way that still resonates today, which is incredible because it's like, 150 years ago, and still makes sense today, and is very affecting. And part of this might be the fact that like I've read it 2 or 3 times. I've watched a dozen adaptations, some every year for 30 years, right? But I chose some of my favorite quotes that if you're like me and you have consumed these adaptations, you know them by heart, right? So from the beginning of the novel, describing Scrooge: "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrow and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it out 1 degree at Christmas." And he's using, color and temperature to describe his temperament, right?
Yeah.
We're describing his physical appearance, but we're also describing the way he acts and the way he interacts with each other, and says so much in such a small amount of space. It's incredible writing, in my opinion. One of my favorite scenes is when Marley visits him at the beginning, because I think it sort of does the sort of pyramid that if you've ever like been taught how to give a presentation, they're like, tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what, tell them the thing you're going to, frick. I don't know if you've ever done this, but like at the beginning of the presentation, you're supposed to tell them what you're going to tell them. Then during the presentation, you tell them the things that are important. And then at the end, you tell them what you told them. And Marley's telling them what you're going to tell them, right? It summarizes the whole thing in the first 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, and the undertaker, the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I think I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and out of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? I just love the way that they describe that, like, I built this chain and I forged it in life.
Mm-hmm.
What a great way to say that.
Link by link, yard by yard. But also saying yard by yard is expressing how long that chain is. It's measured in yards.
Yes. And then also one of my favorite ones is when Scrooge has his turn at the end, right? He's talking to the spirit of Christmas future. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me, may I sponge away the writing on this stone? Which is such a amazing visual. He's not just asking, can I redeem myself? He's saying, at the gravestone, can I sponge out the writing?
Mm-hmm.
Can this be changed?
Yeah. Well, and I really like the connection there to say, like, I will honor Christmas in my heart. And he's not saying like just on the one day. He says,
right,
and try to keep it all the year. So
I'm going to be a changed person
forever.
Yes.
And I think like even contemporary listeners are probably thinking like, yeah, I don't keep the Christmas spirit all year round. There is
Sure.
like a certain time in my life where I'm like more generous than others or happier than others or whatever. So I'm sure that all of us or most of us fall short of this idea of like keeping the spirit of Christmas all year. Like there's just that one sentence by itself says a lot.
And then Dickens even gives the omniscient narrator it's just excellent text. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good as man, as good as the old city knew, or any good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. I love this. It's so good. I love that, in the Muppet version, we put it in the mouth of Gonzo, and it's profound.
Yeah. Oh, I love how Gonzo drops like all the lines. Like he actually is Charles Dickens in the story. Like he, at the very beginning, he's like, "I'm Charles Dickens," and Rizzo the rat is like, "No, you're not." And he's like, "Shut up!" And then they just keep going. It's really funny. But yeah, and the inflection, he goes, "He did it all and infinitely more." And to Tiny Dim, who did not die, he was the second. Like the Muppet delivery of that's pretty funny as well.
Indeed.
So good.
So before we jump into Batman Noel, I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit about its writer and artist, Lee Bermejo.
Let's do it.
Awesome. Lee Bermejo was born in 1977 in Athens, Ohio, and later would grow up in Bakersfield, California. We don't, or at least I wasn't able to find too much about his youth or his sort of classical training. But what I do know is that, he always wanted to be a comic book artist, and that he was very much trying to break into the industry in the 90s, and eventually would do so at a company called Wildstorm. Are you familiar with Image and Wildstorm and Jim Lee?
No, I'm not familiar with those. I did see in the stuff that I checked out that Dark Knight Returns was one of his major
influences,
inspirations. That he read that and was like, "Holy crap! There's really good art out there, and there's people behind it that make it really good." And that was one of the reasons he wanted to go into comic book writing.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, because he was born in 77 and Dark Knight Returns is like 88 or 89.
Yeah, you got me.
Something like that. So it's like he's right in the pocket. Jim Lee is currently I think his title's editor-in-chief at DC Comics. So he's the bigwig.
Wow.
He is a famous artist. He's important to Batman. I don't want to go too deep on him, but like has drawn some really important storylines, including Batman Hush.
Oh,
and yeah, he kind of sets the prototype for all of the art in DC for the last, 15, 20 years. When they did the reboot of the New 52 in 2011, he literally drew the prototypes of all the characters, and there was a house style, and they all tried to imitate Jim Lee. Right? That's his significance today.
So he and James Gunn are pretty tight right now, huh?
I think they have to be. Yeah. I think they have to be.
Yeah.
Jim Lee was an artist in the 90s, the early 90s. What sort of raised his prominence and his sort of claim to fame was his run that he did of the X-Men with Chris Claremont in the 80s. I believe it was like 84 or 86 or something like that. And he created what you probably think of when you think of the X-Men. The sort of yellow costumes with the blue lines across them, the ones from the the X-Men 1997 cartoon,
the animated cartoon. Yeah,
that's the Jim Lee prototype. He created all those redesigns. They did a relaunch, I think it was like 1994 or something like that, of X-Men, where X-Men #1 is the best-selling comic book of all time. They had like 7 million pre-orders for issue #1. That's Jim Lee. Yeah, he was a big deal. And in the 90s, there was sort of an inversion that happened. Throughout the 80s, you had sort of star writers. And even today, you probably have star writers of comic books. When people talk about comics, they talk about who wrote it. In the 90s, people are talking about artists, star artists. If you knew someone who was drawing it and you liked their art, you would buy their book sight unseen. And so X-Men #1 sells 7 million copies because of Jim Lee, right? They're buying the books because of them. And he's coming up in a sort of a class of artists that are all like that. So like Todd McFarlane, who would, go on to do Spawn at Image Comics, was, did Spider-Man and sold comic books, just because he drew Spider-Man. Yeah. Amongst others. I won't go too deep into it. But basically they broke off in the early mid 90s. They all left, right? They went into, the Marvel offices and the DC offices together, and they said, basically, F you. They took a meeting together and said, we're leaving and we're starting our own company because we sell the comics and you're not going to be anything without us. And that company was called Image Comics. And it was wildly successful for a time. Some of the biggest comics you might be familiar with are from Image Comics. So Spawn, I don't know if you're familiar with him in the 90s movie. The Walking Dead is an Image comic.
Oh, really?
I believe Invincible is an Image comic, amongst others, right? It's sort of their big revolution was that everything would be creator owned, right? So the people who are writing and drawing the books, they own the intellectual property. Image does not, and that continues until this day, right?
That's really cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. If you want to Google or go to YouTube and search like the Image revolution, you're going to find all kind of things about it. Suffice to say, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Like, especially early on at Image, all of the artists, who were starting these separate imprints inside of Image had a big ego, right? Obviously they had a big ego because they went and started this company. And so they don't really get along. They don't work well together. They struggled to be professional and like run a business and like ship books on time and things like that.
Oh, cool.
But Jim Lee's imprint inside of Image was Wildstorm. And so Wildstorm had a bunch of characters like, there was a superhero team called Wildcats that Jim Lee drew. There was a book that was popular for a time called Gen 13 that was like teenager superheroes. And it did pretty well. And ultimately what brings Jim Lee to DC is that DC Comics buys Wildstorm. So that's how that happens. Sure. But Lee Bermejo is seeing all of this happening. He looks up to these guys, right? They're rock stars in the comic book industry, and he wants to go work for them. So he is like showing up to conventions with his portfolio, like trying to show art and trying to get in front of Jim Lee, right? And eventually gets an internship. And in the foreword for Batman Noel, Jim Lee's talking about, Lee Bermejo and when he came to work for him as an intern and saying like, he was a good artist, but he wasn't great, right? Like, he wasn't a standout. He wasn't a star, right? Mm-hmm. And when you look at some of his comics from, the 90s, he was kind of just a journeyman, right? He was doing very similar art to everyone else.
I think he did the Resident Evil comic series.
He did, yes. Mm-hmm. I can't believe you got that. Yeah, and then at DC was also just doing penciling for various books until sort of the late 2010s. No, like 2005, I think, 2008. I can't remember. Okay. He gets paired up with a writer named Brian Azzarello and writes a book called Joker. And this is the first time, he might have done that on Man of Steel, I don't know. But they basically start trusting him to sort of cut loose, right? And rather than being the penciler on like an ongoing series, he starts doing these with Brian Azzarello, big projects where they're graphic novels, right? Mm-hmm. They're standalone, they're out of continuity. And he gets, because he's a great artist, lots of time and lots of money. So he can take more than a month to draw something. He takes a year, 2 years, 3 years to draw something, right? And he gets very, very, very detailed, very, very, very expressive. One of the things that he says is that he wants his art to appear complete, right? So we were just talking about Gotham by Gaslight. You've got Mike Mignola, who says, like, Batman looks better the less you draw of him. Lee Bermejo is the exact opposite, right?
Exact opposite,
He wants every pore, every stitch, right? Very, very detailed. And as time has gone on, he's gotten better and better and better. So if you look at the art in Joker, it is detailed, but it's not as detailed as what's in Batman Noel.
Yeah.
And he's gone on from then to do things that are even more detailed. He's very painterly.
It's unbelievable. Like I read it and I spent some time thinking about like how long does it take to put together 100 pages of a book like this? Like all of the and I don't know how big they draw on the originals. I'm imagining they get shrunk down for the books, maybe.
I think they're 11 by 17 comic pages normally.
Yeah, but it's bigger. So the style is described as like realistic, and I think it's not. Mm-hmm. I think it's actually more than that. It's like realistic, but if you like crank the contrast up, like there's way more detail than I think you would see in real life. It's extraordinary.
It is. It's a very unique style. He's kind of one of the most respected artists that works today. He's sort of in the same conversation with artists like Alex Ross, who's sort of a famous Marvel artist that is much the same. Always now works with colorists that work in wash and watercolors, does not work with digital colorists. So one of the things that, to keep comic books fast and going out quickly, today most comic books are colored digitally, and they have a sort of specific style where you can tell that they started with flats, which is like each section, it's like you use the paint bucket tool, right? And then they come in afterwards and provide texture and volume and things like that. And it's not bad. In fact, I quite appreciate that style, but it's very different than someone coming in afterwards on paper with watercolors and painting on top of the pencils, which he always does now. Lee Bermejo. And yeah, this is on display in Batman Noel. So I definitely think you ought to look up the art if you're listening to this episode. Don't just let it end with us. So everything we've talked about up until now, Lee Bermejo is doing art for someone else's book. Batman Noel is the first time that Lee Bermejo writes. He has said that he's always felt that he wanted to do some writing at some point. It's something he had to do. You know, Batman Noel is his first attempt, and he wrote the whole script for the entire thing before he started drawing anything, before he pitched it to DC. So he kind of went in with this complete idea and said, hey, will you let me do this thing? And they said yes. There's not a whole lot of interviews or anything on the record about it. I did find one, I think that was from Newsarama at the time in 2011 when he wrote the book, and I'll leave a link to it in the notes. But he's on the record about a few things where, you know, he says that one of the reasons he wanted to do A Christmas Carol was because it was more of a kid's book. And the interviewer's like, what, a kid's book? This isn't a kid's book. And he says, no. My wife makes fun of me when I mention kids because she says, if you think this Batman story is for kids, you clearly don't know kids. And it's pretty obvious you don't have children. I don't think it's a children's book, but it has visual qualities and a narrative quality that mirrors a children's story, purposefully so. I think there's something very interesting about that juxtaposition. It's hard to imagine Batman in a children's book. I like that contrast, and I like juxtaposing things like that. When I was a kid, 4 or 5 years old, I was obsessed with the Batman TV show in the 60s, and I took it totally seriously. At that age, I took it completely seriously. I didn't get the fact that it was kind of played for laughs. I didn't understand why my mom was rolling her eyes and chuckling. I think there's something kind of interesting there. To play the book seriously, but kind of wink and nod. So
that's an interesting take. I mean, that's how I feel about like Batman Forever. Like, I was young when it came out. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea at the time that it was like being lighthearted about some stuff.
Sure.
And like history has not looked fondly upon that movie, and I do. I love it. And I get it now. Like I'm an adult and I understand like Batman a little bit more deeply, and I can see the references to like Silver Age stuff and whatnot.
Sure.
That is humorous, but I also still completely love it. So
right.
yeah,
and I think this is interesting because it's sort of coming at that from a different direction of like a silly interpretation on a serious idea. This is a serious interpretation of something that's not silly, but like very lighthearted and about generosity and kindness, right? Because you got the guy who draws, the pores on Batman's face and the stitches in his, costume, and there's all kinds of blood and bone, and it's that guy. It's the hyper realism, hyper violent, hyper, mature guy, and he's doing A Christmas Carol, right? So that, I think, is setting the stage for the story, if we want to talk about it.
Yeah, let's do it. So, describing the cover, it is pretty, I don't know, desaturated is the word. It's very gray, different shades of gray for the most part, and some browns. It is Batman looking real angry, fist clenched, teeth bared, and apparently in some sort of a graveyard. We've got, there's snow coming down. There's a statue angel over his shoulder. That's kind of my read on it, but the just kind of exhibiting a whole lot of rage. And then obviously, since we know it's Lee Bermejo, excellent delivery, I guess, of that vision and like artistic quality.
It's interesting. Yeah. You do see on full display his sort of like painterly style. It is like fully rendered and highly detailed. I do think the composition on this is kind of garbo. We have a foreground, a foreground of Batman, a middle ground of this sort of angel carving, and then a background of like mausoleum or something. But the perspective is totally borked. Like it doesn't make sense. Like there's no. If this were taken with a camera, you would expect some sort of depth of field, some blur or something like that. If you were seeing it in real life, I don't know that everything vertically makes sense. Like in order for the angel to be that tall over the shoulder, it has to be remarkably close and taller than Batman, because if it was further away, he would be taller than it.
Like massive statue.
Yeah, it's not great. And then also, like, you don't really get a proper sense of depth of like his fists in front of his, like, it looks like his fists are almost flat against his chest because there's no separation between it and his pecs. It doesn't, it's not the best art. I think it's Lee Bermejo not sending his best here.
I'm guessing this was a thing that was like edited together with computers, and it wasn't all put together at once. Like, especially if you look at like the way that the cape is touching the like foggy background of that mausoleum and stuff, it's just a little bit oddly crisp. and stuff. My biggest problem with it is the white text on a light,
sure.
the whole thing. Like you can't. It's thin text. It's white. It's not very readable. It's Lieber something. Bat.
Sure. Now that you're saying it, you're probably right. Is that he wrote the book and it's so perfectly done and so wonderfully rendered and everything is perfectly thought out, and then he delivers it to the publisher and some other artist gets this together and makes the cover and is just not quite up to par. I mean, it's fine. I shouldn't hate on it so hard, but for how sort of perfect the art is inside, this is not that.
Yeah, don't judge this book by its cover.
No, please don't. Although I will say, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. I don't know that Lee Bermejo's prose specifically is particularly stellar. I think he has a really cool idea and he has a lot of really great sequences and stuff, but this book is great because of the art, not necessarily because of the writing.
Yeah, I think the overall story is good and stuff, but I think a lot of it is, frankly, it's kind of skippable.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, at the very, very beginning, there's some kind of foreword that I did not read. I just scrolled right past it because I'm not into that stuff. So
I would assume that's the letter from Jim Lee that I was talking about, which is interesting, but it's not important to the book. So we open to beautiful and expansive shots of the Gotham, city skyline. We've got billboards, we've got skyscrapers, several pages of it. You definitely get the sense that Bermejo's like stretching his legs. He's not in a hurry. And we've got a narrator who's trying to tell the story of A Christmas Carol, but he's doing it pretty bad. Can't remember the name of Scrooge as an example. And I think it's a shtick, right? Like, it's like, oh, this is a dude who knows the story kinda, and he's telling it bad, right? And that's supposed to be endearing, but I find it kind of annoying because I do know the story well.
Yeah. And you're a much more precise person than I think the average individual is.
Sure. It meanders and I prefer concise, right? I think that there's power in something that is to the point, and this is not that. And, as he's telling the story of A Christmas Carol, that story roughly aligns with what's happening on the panels in the rest of the book. So like he's telling, Scrooge and Bob Cratchit and Marley's story. He doesn't really reference Batman. He doesn't reference, characters in the book, but the beats kind of line up in a cool way.
Yeah, it's like halfway through the book, maybe not halfway, but a ways into the book before you realize that's the Scrooge they're talking about is Batman.
Yes, I have notes on that when we get there. Like,
okay,
the first time I read this, I was confused. I didn't understand fully who the players were going to be.
Right. I didn't know it was Christmas Carol themed. I just thought that someone was like talking about. No, I mean, I knew it was Christmas because it's Batman Noel, right? And I'm just reading.
Oh wow,
through
that's
it.
awesome!
You just told me to read.
I
this
can't
book,
believe you went in cold.
Yeah, I was just reading it. I try to everything you give me. I try to start cold, and then I learn about it afterward. And so, like, I'm going in, and I'm like, I'm just kind of confused. I'm like, okay, they're talking about Scrooge, all right? So who's Scrooge going to be? What is this about? And then there's this dude who shows up.
Wow, I wish I had your experience.
And they're.
Do you think that made you appreciate it more?
I don't know. I didn't read it the other way.
Okay, fair enough.
I read it the first time.
Yeah. Okay.
And so there's this dude who shows up and he's they kind of suggest that this dude's name is Bob. So it's like, okay, this is Bob, and they're talking about Bob Cratchit. And it's like, okay, so this is Bob Cratchit, and I'm reading through it that way. And Bob Cratchit, they're making these comparisons between the way that Bob Cratchit and Ebenezer Scrooge and stuff are in the Christmas Carol to what this person is doing. I don't have any like exact pull quotes, but it says like, take Bob, for example. If he could, old Bob here would change almost everything about his life. And they're kind of describing how he just doesn't have a lot of money. And he's, unfortunately, like a lot of people in Gotham, to get by, he has turned to crime to make the money. And so he picks up, or he drops off a package in like a boarded up window, and then a package pops out. Then you don't know what's in it, and he picks up. So he's just kind of like a criminal. I don't know what you call that, like a driver or something. He's a bagman, I guess.
Yeah, bagman. And you get the sense that like he's not comfortable with it. Like he's breaking out in cold sweats. He's looking over his shoulders, right? He's in over his head,
Yeah,
right?
he's a novice
And
criminal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is our Bob Cratchit, right? They do say he's working for a Scrooge. He's working for a bad guy. And Scrooge is an awful boss, doesn't give his workers Christmas off, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he does this trade. He puts a bag in a boarded up window. Package comes out, and he picks it up and starts walking away. And he's walking down the street, and then like Batman swoops in, and scares him shitless.
Which, like in Gotham, Batman has a reputation. Like in most of the movies we see, there is that moment where like the lights, it starts to get dark, and like crime rolls up its stairs or whatever. What do you call that? They roll up their front porch or whatever. Because do you know what I'm talking about? That terrible metaphor that I'm... Anyway, there's a reputation there of like, Batman can't be everywhere, but I really don't want to bump into him, so I do my crime during the day instead. And so it is kind of funny that like this dude's probably thinking like, there's no way I'm gonna run into like the King of Justice of all people. I'm nobody. And then it's very expressive the way he's screaming, and he runs, and Batman throws a bolo or something, catches his legs, he trips, Bob trips, and package falls, and money comes out of it. So now it's like really, really clear to us that he's like being a bad dude.
Yeah, he just fenced something. Like maybe it was drugs, maybe it was we don't know, but like he got money for it.
Mm-hmm.
And Batman like gets up in his face, and he's got his fist, and he's like gonna punch him. It doesn't, but he's like scaring the crap out of him. And he says, "Do you have any idea what was in that bag you delivered? You should be going to jail. Consider yourself lucky that you make a better piece of live bait than jail bait." And sort of walks away and leaves him there. And Bob runs away, from Batman.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have the package. He doesn't have the money, but we do see that he's got a tracker sort of pinned to him. So Batman has placed a tracker on him.
Yeah. And so kind of what Batman says here is he kind of calls him out like, how do you know where you're supposed to deliver that? And Bob is like, I don't know who I'm working for. This is all by notes. I was going to get another note about where to deliver this thing. I really don't know anything at all. And so he puts that tracker on him, and he calls him bait because, and he kind of mentions like, you're working for the Joker, and the Joker's going to come for his money.
Right. And in the next scene, we have a couple pages where, I think we're trying to establish that Batman's like trying to track down the Joker. So he like shows up at one of his hideouts, and we get, Lee Bermejo kind of like drawing crazy, like, marionettes and like Joker, mannequins and stuff like that. It's like clearly a hideout. And he gets there, and, Joker's not there, but he leaves a note, and he's like, you'll get me next time.
Yeah. Is it too little too late or something like that?
Yeah.
The joke's on you. Something like that.
Yeah. I think these pages really just serve as like showing that Batman, that Joker's the true villain. It's not this Bob Cratchit person, right? Yeah. And that's who he's tracking, and that's why he's tracking Bob Cratchit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting at this point, when I'm reading it the first time, I'm thinking, okay, well, Joker's Scrooge, because now we've established that Bob Cratchit is working for Scrooge, and Scrooge is a bad guy.
Yeah.
And Batman's tracking Scrooge, or tracking Joker, so Joker must be Scrooge, right? So that's where my head's at.
Yeah.
And then we cut to... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so after it cuts from Batman, it keeps following Bob Cratchit home. And obviously he's impoverished because he comes home and his kid is making a Christmas tree out of like junk that he found in the neighborhood, including like he talked to the lady next door because she had a dead plant, and she let him have it. And that's what the Christmas tree is like built out of, is like a dead plant. But he's like a jolly kid. He's like, "Hey Dad, let me show you this thing. I worked on it." And Bob over here, he just had the run in of his lifetime. His heart's pounding a mile a minute. And he like slams the door closed, and he's like back to the door and is like, "Shut up. Not right now." He like cusses at his kid.
Yeah, not right now.
And kid looks super sad. Like, I mean, saddest looking child face I've ever seen in art. And Bob is like, "Oh man, I screwed up." And he like goes to say like, "Oh, you did a good job. I like it.
I didn't mean to snap at you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I kind of had a rough day today." And the kid is talking about how he made this Christmas tree, and it's really cool. And he said he was reminded of a friend who had a Superman ornament. He's like, I was really hoping to get like a Batman ornament. And Bob is like, why would you want a Batman ornament? That dude is scary. And the kid's like, but he's a good guy. I mean, he goes after bad guys. And then Bob like looks out the window and is like, well, sometimes even good people do bad things, like because he's a bad guy, right? Like he's not living up to his kid's image of right and wrong, right?
I think this is building out Bob as kind of a tragic character, right? Because he's had a real bad day, right? He was working for Joker, which clearly he didn't want to do. He was very uncomfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gets confronted by Batman, which is kind of the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. Now he doesn't have the money that Joker's looking for. So Joker's going to come at some point wanting the money, or whoever, the person with the note. And he's not going to have it. And so what's going to happen to him?
Right.
You know, he's snapping at his kid. So he's not, you know, being the parent he wants to be.
Right.
And in the art, we're seeing the house as kind of a very Spartan, very poor place. We're seeing, you know, they're living in quite poverty. And so I think this is meant to be very sympathetic for Bob.
Yeah.
And then we cut to the Batcave.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the narrator points out to us, and we start to realize that Joker isn't our Scrooge, despite that Bob is working for Joker. It's Bruce. The narrator talks about how Scrooge's place was dimly lit and cold and damp, which we just talked about. Dickens is describing Scrooge that way. And while we're seeing pictures of the Batcave, which I think is so clever, right? It's dark and dingy and wet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how Scrooge is completely obsessed with work. And at that same time, we're seeing the Batcomputer, and it's pictures of Joker, a picture of Bob Cratchit, pictures of Tiny Tim, right? So really, really clever, I think, the way that they fit the art and the narration together to tell the story, to say like, oh, yeah, Bruce is our Scrooge.
Oh, and also the comparison that like he's this rich dude who goes and lives alone, and he doesn't have friends. He's not the type who would go and celebrate the holidays. He's the type who would be alone in his dark, dank cave doing work.
Yes.
Yeah.
It also makes more sense at this moment. It's clicking for me. I'm like, yes, of course, because if we're going to redeem someone, we can't redeem the Joker at the end of the story. We're going to redeem Bruce, right?
Yeah.
We established that Bruce has a cough and that he's sick. And, you know, Alfred kind of fusses after him. And then Alfred sees what's on the computer screen. He says, hey, why are you looking at these guys? And Bruce explains that he's using, you know, Bob as bait to get to the Joker. And Alfred's like, you're going to traumatize this kid. And Bruce is like kind of cold and is like, listen, the kid is in just as much risk and just as much trouble being parented by a criminal as he is going to be alone. Right.
Yeah. No, he says specifically, like, I'm betting on this kid turning out just like his dad, a criminal, right? Which is not seeing the good in people, it's seeing the bad in people, right?
And Alfred's like, hey, you know, I remember a kid who didn't have his parents, and you know, I know how that goes.
And we took a chance on him, and it's Robin, by the way.
Do what?
And it's Robin.
Oh, I think at that moment he's talking about Bruce. That Alfred is watching after Bruce when he loses his parents. But maybe they're talking about Robin. I want to get to that because as Alfred's leaving, right, he says, I'm going to give you some cold meds. We get introduced to our Bob Marley. Our Bob Marley is Robin. So the narrator's telling Bob Marley, sorry. Bob Marley's a reggae singer.
Yeah.
Jacob Marley.
Jacob Marley.
I hope I haven't done that in the other parts of this episode. That's really embarrassing.
I hope you have.
I'll have to edit it in. Go, Jacob.
Ooh, Jake.
So our Jacob Marley is Robin.
Yeah.
And specifically, I believe that this is supposed to be Jason Todd. We're skipping way the heck ahead. Are you familiar with who Jason Todd is, Brian?
I know the name. I don't remember what all the endings are for them, so I can get them mixed up. Does this reference is it the Return of the Joker, Jason Todd? Is it that?
I don't know how it factors into. I assume that's the animated movie you're talking about.
Yeah, the animated movie. At the end, they find out that the Joker. It's not that the Joker came back to life. It was some experiment that was done on Robin when he was
sure
being held by
maybe
Harley. I don't remember which Robin that was in that story, but
suffice to say that Dick Grayson, the Robin that we've been talking about in the Golden Age, eventually sort of graduates, right? He goes off to college, he joins the Teen Titans, does his own thing for a while as Robin, and eventually becomes Nightwing. Right. So he's a character that's still kicking around in the DC universe. If you're reading modern day comics, there's a character named Nightwing. That's Dick Grayson. He was the first Robin. The second Robin was a kid named Jason Todd. He was kind of a punk kid. Like the first time Batman runs into him, he's like stealing tires off the Batmobile to like sell them or whatever. And Batman's like, "You're pretty dumb, aren't you?" You know?
That's really funny. You're pretty dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. End up taking him in. He comes to the second ramen. They sort of train him. And his deal is that like he's more despondent. He's not with the program as much. He's kind of a delinquent. He's kind of, you know, and for those reasons, the readership doesn't really like him. And long story short, we'll do a whole episode about all of this stuff. Long story short, Jason Todd ends up getting killed off.
Is this Death in the Family?
Yes.
Okay.
It is, which is a storyline in the 80s, which is at least an episode, if not more. But the gist is that in all modern sort of Batman comics that have happened since, this is part of Batman's pathos, right? It has become part of the canon of like, this is the one that he screwed up. He brought this kid in who wasn't right for the role in the first place, put him in harm's way, and he died, right? And so he feels grief and regret and remorse. And I think it's the perfect Jacob Marley, right? Because they were partners in life, right? There's estrangement, there's loss, right? Which is the way he feels about Jacob Marley. And how that, that anger and that loss consumes Scrooge, in this case, Bruce. And we're telling that story as we're seeing the sort of light over the Robin costume in the cave.
Yeah.
Bruce is breaking out in cold sweats, staring and blinking at the Jason Todd costume, or the Robin costume, as the case may be. They don't explicitly say it's Jason Todd.
Yeah. There is a bit of like a flashback where he is kind of remembering how things used to be. I mean, the color in the story changes. Like it's a much brighter color when like Robin's there and the sky is like kind of lit up with a reddish gold color. I'm just saying, yeah, we were younger and things were good. Essentially, I mean, I don't know if there's anything more interesting there to point out, but yeah, that for this beat, he's Jacob Marley. And then he comes out of it. Bruce like blinks and he realizes like, no, that's just the costume sitting over there. There's no kid in it. And then he goes back to like brooding. Yeah.
Of the four spirits that appear in this book, I think this is one of the stronger ones for me. Although it is very quick. Like this one only lasts like a couple pages. Blink and you'll miss it. If you're not paying attention, you may not even realize that this is the Jacob Marley.
Right. It is fast too. Yeah.
Yeah. Cut to later. Batman meets Gordon on a rooftop because Gordon has the bat signal on. So it's the same night he's going back out. And Gordon says like, "Hey, I've got a lead on the Joker, but it's Catwoman. You need to go talk to her."
Yeah.
And Batman's like, "I don't have time for this. You know, she's trying to mess with me." He's coughing a lot. And Gordon's like, "Hey, you should get that cough looked at." And yeah, ultimately he decides to go after Catwoman.
Jump ahead to where he's on a rooftop.
He's gotten to her just as she's pulled off a robbery.
The clock strikes 1. It's 1:00 in the shot.
Oh, I didn't catch that. Yeah.
Up above there. Yeah. And so he jumps down on the rooftop and he starts talking with her. And she's like, "Yeah, good old times. Good to see you, Bats." And he basically is like, "I don't have time to chase you." And she's got jewels and stuff. And she's like, "What is your deal, man? There was a time where you just would not stop at anything to catch me. What's going on?" And he kind of does a similar flashback of like Catwoman looks different than she does now. And he makes some kind of nasty comments where he says, "It was never for," she says, "Yeah, we used to do this stuff for fun." He's like, "It was never for fun. Sick people like you think this sort of thing is fun," or whatever. And she kind of lashes out at him. She's like, "How dare you? Sick people like me? You think I'm the one that's sick?" Is kind of more talking about like the other villains, not saying that Batman is sick. But yeah, she's really ticked at him.
Yeah. No, you definitely get the vibe that like she has an infatuation with Batman and she's like drawn very sexually and she like grinds up on him or whatever. And like that she has an enjoyment with the cat and mouse of the like, "Why don't you chase me? Aren't you interested in me? Don't you have a," and he's like, "No, I just care about Joker." Like very much like, "I don't have time for your crap. I'm not interested in you. I'm not interested in the chase. This is not a game." Right. So yeah, we get these flashbacks to prior escapades. Catwoman is wearing the Golden Age costume, the one that we were talking about, where it's kind of a purple dress. And that's right. Batman's got the sort of yellow symbol with the bat, and he's like much more Golden Age traditional costume. It's a little silly. She's got like a tiger for some reason, and like Robin's tied up, and it's definitely, you get the sense that like it's romanticizing and like harkening back to a different time. And when we have a different flashback in a couple pages, and we've got Batman's like smiling as he's like punching the penguin. Robin is smiling, and they're standing in front of a Batmobile that very much looks like the Batman 1966 Batmobile, right? That there's some amount of like, hey, you know, there was a happiness to you. There was this, you know, and it's gesturing at the Silver Age, which I think is kind of cool. And Lee Bermejo gets to stretch his legs. He draws Penguin and Two-Face and Scarecrow and you know, Joker.
Yeah. It's actually really kind of fun to see his take on what these characters would look like.
And at this point, like, you get the sense that maybe these flashbacks have sort of ignited the fire in Bruce a little bit, and he does take chase. So Catwoman starts running across the rooftops, and he's going after her.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, they're running across the rooftops, and Catwoman sort of jumps over, you know, a gap between two buildings. And there's like a gargoyle, and Batman's reaching out like he's not going to make the jump, and gets his hand on the gargoyle, and does it break? I forget.
Well, so it's interesting because she jumps over the gap and uses the gargoyle to climb up, but that's when it cracks. And she kind of looks back like, oh no, he's going to grab the same gargoyle. And he does, and it breaks, and then he falls, like the man that's falling. Of course, as he's falling, they have to do the flashback to his parents dying in an alleyway.
Yeah, you get the sense that he's fallen like four stories, and then he's in an alley now. And so that reminds him of his parents. And
he's like hurt, and he's kind of getting up. And you could say the clock strikes 2, but I don't see that.
Sure.
But it's the ghost of Christmas present is here, and it's Superman.
Yeah, he's like, I heard you coughing all the way from Metropolis. Do you need a hand? Looks like he could use one.
Yeah. I will say this is the ghost in this story that is the strongest for me. Like his demeanor in this section is so starkly different than Batman's, because Batman in this issue is just like angry
and bitter. Yeah,
just like super bitter and angry. And Superman comes in,
and Superman's showing up for his friend.
Yeah, and he's very colorized in comparison, like just in the art.
He's glowing almost,
and he just seems really also kind of like pensive in the way that he's like behaving with Batman. And he does a X-ray vision on him, and he sees that his lungs are unhappy, and he's saying, "Hey, you should go see a doctor." And Batman's all ticked off, and he's like, "You know what? You don't even act like you know what a cold is like."
Don't you have someone you should be saving, you know?
Yeah, leave the medical advice to the professionals. And Superman's like, well, at least let me give you a ride, like fly you back to your car. And Batman's like, on one condition, I'm gonna go check on my bait. Yeah. And they fly over to
so they go to Bob Cratchit's house.
On Bob Cratchit's house. And Superman is kind of like, this is wrong. This isn't the right way to do this, right? And
yes.
Batman's like, justice comes at a price, and I gotta catch the Joker. And it gives you some shots of the inside where Bob and his son are having a good time, and his son has a picture that says "Merry Christmas, Dad," and it's a picture of Batman. And I kind of when I read this, it's like the way he's like looking at his dad, he's got the picture up, he's saying like, "You're my Batman, Dad, you're my superhero," which is like also that juxtaposition is kind of interesting, because like Bob's just had that run-in with Batman and is like not super happy with Batman, but like that symbolism is still kind of nice from his son.
Yeah, before, you know, Bob is distressed and he's unhappy, and he's, you know, and the colors are warm. We don't see as much of the poverty in the house. He's smiling. You get the sense that they're having a warm moment with each other. Superman, Clark, says to Bruce, you know, hey, Bob could go to prison. And Batman says, you know, that would only decrease the surplus population,
there you go.
Criminal population. Yeah, which I thought was an interesting sort of way to try to wedge that in.
Yeah.
And, you know, Superman says it's not the way to go.
Which to me, like that line is like the coldest thing Batman says in this whole issue is to say like, well, it will, because he's saying like, hey, what will happen to this kid if his dad, in as far as we can tell, single parent, goes to prison, right? And Batman's like, he deserves it. It doesn't matter about the kid. Like, there's one more criminal off the street. Whatever, justice comes at a cost, you know. And it's like, geez, man.
And then Superman takes, Batman and is flying with him. It's kind of funny. He's like grabbing him under the shoulders and it looks, Batman looks very awkward and unhappy. And Superman says, look as hard at your lambs as you do as your lions. Sometimes I think that helping people, saving people could be just as easy as showing your face. And we get this like very somber look of Superman's looking down on the city. And we get these visions of, families together. We have a couple sitting together on a park bench. We have a mother reading a book to her child. We have, what looks like maybe a married couple giving a gift to their parents or something like that. We see, the positive things that are happening in Gotham City. And we see that, Clark sees those things and he's asking Bruce, don't you see these things?
Yeah. And then they swoop by Gordon's house, which is really interesting. This is one of the more interesting points in the issue to me, because Gordon's talking to some officer and the officer's like, hey, why are you hanging out with this Batman guy? Like, do you feel like ethically okay with the situation? And Gordon's like, it's really hard to describe, but Batman is helpful and he does things that maybe we can't do. He has good results, but he wavers on that line between good and bad. And we might hesitate. He doesn't. And I'm worried that if I'm not here, he will just go to the other side of the line entirely. So I'm kind of reminding him what's good.
Yeah, the officer says, do you ever wonder what will happen if he goes too far? And Gordon says, I worry about that constantly.
Exactly. So then Superman drops Batman off at his car, and he's basically like, hey, go take care of yourself, and maybe you should have Alfred give you a ride home. And Batman's like, tersely, car's got autopilot. And Superman's like, well, anyway, see ya. And he's gone. And then Batman hits his like remote to his key fob or whatever to unlock his Batmobile, and it explodes.
Which I think is really funny, the idea that the Batmobile has a key fob.
Yeah, well, I also think it's really funny that like the Batmobile blows up and Superman didn't come back.
Oh yeah, it's true. He doesn't.
And so at this point, the Joker shows up. Like apparently he's booby trapped the Batmobile, and he grabs Batman and drags him off into a cemetery. He's just kind of giving him a lot of guff about how he's getting old and weak and he can be beaten, essentially, and Batman falls unconscious. Now, my read on this is that this didn't happen.
Interesting.
I think that the car never blew up. That's how I'm reading this situation because of what happens later on, in that he just kind of fell unconscious.
I definitely get the vibe that Lee Bermejo is again just stretching his legs, right? He wants to draw this cool scene, and he takes pages and pages and pages of Joker dragging Batman through the snow into a graveyard. And so whether it's metaphorical or literal, maybe doesn't matter.
Yeah, fair enough.
But it's beautiful art.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the Joker is the Ghost of Christmas Future. He is the Grim Reaper of sorts. And in his unconscious dreams or whatever, Batman gets to see what the future looks like. And the future looks like a whole lot of mayhem of people who are dressed up as Batman to do justice, but they're not doing justice in the right way. It's chaotic justice.
Like roving gangs. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of gangs, lots of fire, people running in the streets, beating each other with bats and stuff. He also sees Gordon being sentenced to 30 years in prison for aiding and abetting, harboring a fugitive. Basically, he's going to prison because he helped Batman. He sees...
Yeah, he's standing trial.
That's right. He sees there's a estate sale on the Wayne Manor, and Alfred is watching all of Bruce Wayne's, or the Wayne family's stuff get sold at an estate auction. And Batman wakes up and he sees on a tombstone, it says, "Here lies a bat. He died boring, predictable, and nobody loved him."
So that's the Ebenezer Scrooge gravestone.
Yeah.
And we then cut to we pan down from the gravestone, and we see Batman's fist punch out of the ground, a la Night of the Living Dead, and or
Kill Bill.
The Boba Fett TV show or whatever. Kill Bill. Yeah.
He had been buried alive, and this is his resurrection.
Yeah.
Right?
He's climbing out of the grave. It's a little stupid.
Yeah, which for me like further solidifies this did not happen.
The whole thing is a little wishy-washy.
Yeah.
And then we cut to Bob Cratchit's house. Bob is sleeping on the floor with a baseball bat in his hand, like he's expecting, someone to come and beat him up. Tim is in the bed, looking at, a piece of paper or something, and there's a knock on the door. And Tim says, "Santa, is that you?" He runs to it.
Mm-hmm. Door cracks open and kind of like Jack in The Shining. We've got the Joker.
Yeah, kind of crazy face.
Yeah, really intense. Sticking his face through the crack, going ho, ho, ho. He breaks the door open and he basically like immediately starts kind of hounding this kid about his dad and threatening him. Yeah. And you see Bob is in the next room holding the bat, like kind of hiding behind the door frame. And this is kind of funny how not funny, but interesting how the Joker jumps into like, well, let's play a game. Let's play a game of Clue. Who killed Dad? And he pulls out a wrench and stuff like that. And he's saying like, also your dad must be a real wimp because he's letting you deal with me, So Bob runs in. He takes a swing at the Joker. Joker dodges it. And he bashes Bob in the face with a crescent wrench. And he says, "How are we ever going to solve the mystery of my missing money if you're missing half your face?" And Bob is
he's got like a revolver. He's pointing it at Bob.
He's got a gun in his face, right? And Bob is like, "I panicked. It was Batman." Kind of like, what was I supposed to do? And the Joker's like, "Who killed Bob?"
"I killed Bob in the kitchen with the revolver." Yeah, kind of like Clue.
"I win. I killed Bob in the kitchen with the revolver." And right then, before he can shoot, Batman swings in the window, knocks down the Joker, knocks the gun out of his hand, and the Joker's kind of down. And Bob pulls up the gun and is like, basically, "I'm going to kill you." The Joker's like, "Do it, man." And Batman, having learned from the previous 70 pages, says, "No, man, don't do it. Think about your kid. Show him what a hero is," which also kind of harkens back to that Batman picture that his son had drawn for him, kind of saying, you're my hero. Show him what a hero is.
No, I was just going to say that it's kind of drawn out. We've got multiple panels. We've got like a whole page with Bob standing over him with the gun, and he pulls the action back and it clicks. You get the sense that he's getting ready. He's trying to decide. He's got his face is like, in a grimace. He's kind of like got the scary eyes of like, "I'm going to kill you." And you get the sense like Bob's really thinking about it. This is going to happen. And, Batman's like, whoa. Show your son the kind of man you are. And then we have Bob is like, he's still got crazy eyes for a second. He's sitting there and, Batman says, "Show him what a hero is." And then he kind of softens and the sort of grimace and the crazy smile goes away and he drops the gun. Joker says, "Boring."
And then the next page, you've got Joker being put in the back of a police car by some officers, and Commissioner Gordon looks up at the silhouette of Batman up on the top of a building and kind of smiles like, "I'm glad he did the right thing." And then there, the next
saved
page,
Bob instead of sacrificing him.
Right. And then in the next page, it's got Batman in the Batcave with his feet up on the Bat computer with kind of a blanket. Yeah, I think he's got a blanket over him and he's asleep. And it says something about him being really sick, something like kind of like a free man.
Yeah, old Scroogey was lucky to wake up the next morning and he knew it.
Yeah. And Alfred is kind of doting on him. He's smiling about it. And then what happens to Scrooge the morning of Christmas Day? He fixes everything.
He keeps his promise.
That's what that's what Bruce is doing in the next page. I kind of wonder if Bob worked for Wayne Manor, or not Wayne Manor, for Wayne Enterprises or something.
Yeah. This is the part where like it gets a little wishy-washy. Yeah, some Wayne Enterprises employees show up and say, "Here's a Christmas tree," and like they, hand him an envelope. And the narrator, who at this point has not been breaking the fourth wall, as actually narrating. He's telling a parallel story. He says, today, though, he figured it was high time to pay him back. A raise, benefits, PTO, 401k, the works. So you get the vibe that like maybe he's being offered a job, or maybe he had a crummy job with Wayne Enterprises and he's getting a raise. Not super clear. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Bob has been working for Joker the whole time, but now he's working for Wayne, I guess.
Right. Well, at the beginning, it says he was working for a Scrooge. And it's like, was he talking about his job that he had to kind of moonlight with the Joker for? Or is he saying like,
that would make sense.
The like a Scrooge meaning the Joker? It's not clear.
Yeah. You got to do a lot of filling in the blanks yourself here. But
yeah. So he gives Bob the pay raise. He gives him the biggest turkey, etc. And then it goes to Commissioner Gordon, who
GCPD.
Yeah. You go ahead.
No, they just are having a party and having a good time. The police officers are happy, and the narrator's talking about Scrooge made the rounds that day. Old friends, business associates, pretty much anyone who previously made miserable. He wanted to show him the good guy he could be. He could set things straight. So I don't know. You get the vibe that maybe Bruce is throwing a party for them. It's not clear.
Yeah. Oh, it just kind of finishes on Bob sitting on a stool. You can see that they've eaten their feast and they've got their Christmas tree and stuff, but he's sitting there with his son sitting on his lap, just kind of holding him, and he says, so what do you think? What is the moral of the story? And you find out that Bob was the narrator. Yeah.
So what happens here is you've got the first half of the sentence is the narrator script that they've been doing in captions the whole time. Says this, I don't know, kiddo. And then we cut to Bob with Tim sitting on his lap, and it's a speech bubble. And he says, what do you think? Finishing the sentence. What's the moral of the story? So it's the last panel reveal that the narrator the whole time has been Bob, which I think is stupid and a cheap reveal, but there it is.
But it's also like a Christmas Carol. It's got the happy ending.
It's sweet.
It's that sappy thing at the end, right?
Yeah. We also, on the next last page, there's a panel of like Tim walking down the street. I assume on Christmas Day, it's snowy outside. He puts himself in a cape.
Oh, you like Tiny Tim, Bob's kid. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Maybe like he's a Superman or Batman figure himself.
You really threw me because we had talked about Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, and when you said Tim, I was like, Tim Drake? What? But
no. Tiny Tim.
Tiny Tim. I'm with you.
I guess they don't explicitly say at any point that his name is Tim.
No,
but that is the analog that they're doing for sure. So that's Batman Noel. What do you think?
That was a heck of a ride. I mean, it was good. It was fun. It's like the perfect Christmas comic. Certainly for Batman universe. It does not shed a very positive light on Batman because he is a Scrooge and like very vengeful and wrathful throughout most of the story.
Yeah.
But he does, in the last handful of pages, he does kind of turn that around a little bit. But very well done, very well executed. Like you said, the writing's a little cheesy, but I give it a pass because it's a Christmas story.
Mm-hmm.
And I like it. It warms my heart a little bit.
Yeah, I think the ideas are very clever. I think the set pieces are great. It's not conceptually flawed, right? It executes on what it's trying to do very well. It's like the prose. It's like the narration, the lines are kind of cheesy at times. You know, they kind of shoehorn in things like decrease the surplus criminal population. I'm
exactly,
like, no. And there's certain things that feel cheap, like Bob's the narrator at the end. Like, okay. But the art is incredible. It carries the story, and the idea is cool. And the sort of critical reception is incredibly positive. People think that this is one of the best, Christmas comics there is. Certainly, probably the best Batman Christmas comic. Hey, Bat family, we're throwing up the bat signal. If you made it this far, we hope you liked the show. If you put a like on the video, it'll help us find more Cape Crusaders. And if you subscribe, you'll never miss a future episode. Drop a comment down below telling us what we got wrong, or you can head on over to batlessons.com and write us an email or send us a voice memo. We'll talk about your feedback on a future episode of the show. That's also where you can find show notes and transcripts for every episode and links to all of our social media. Thanks for listening.